That'll probably do it. There we go.
There you go.
Now I'm recording. So Thursday, I'll go over what I want you guys to know for the final. What I'm going to do for the finals, I'm going to give you guys a few questions. Hopefully some questions that'll take some thought. And I'll give you guys the option of putting down your answers in writing, or you could just make a video and send it to me. Since we're supposed to do oral presentations in this class, I didn't really, we kind of got behind, and I didn't really get that going. This will give us an opportunity to do that. All right. I'll start down my list. Going back to the Chapter 6 reading quiz. There was a question about how other jazz musicians viewed bebop. Keep in mind that, bebop was like kind of this special counterculture music, and a lot of jazz musicians at the time didn't like it at all and didn't want to have anything to do with it. So, the old timers like Louis Armstrong, he heard bebop and he thought it was amazing, but he never tried to play like that. He just I can't do that. And he just kept going with what he was doing. And there were other musicians who didn't like it at all. And so it wasn't like everybody jumped on this bebop bandwagon. So it's like one of the times when kind of musicians started to split on the style, and some musicians were playing in the bebop style and some weren't. That's important to note. Also during this time, there's a resurgence in what they call traditional jazz. All this time, throughout all of jazz history, there were still people when the original New Orleans style started morphing into, started evolving into something else. Even in the 1920s, there were people who were saying, that's this new thing, we shouldn't call that jazz. We should call the old thing jazz and come up with a new name for this other stuff. And that was certainly true during the swing era when you had the swing bands. There were people who said, no, we should call that swing and we should call jazz should be like New Orleans style. So during this whole time, there's still bands out there. There's still people that are playing kind of New Orleans style collective improvisation. That's still going on kind of in the background because it wasn't the cool new thing anymore, but it was there. And during the bebop era in the 40s, we did see a resurgence in what by this time they were starting to call it traditional jazz. And to get away from kind of that location of it's got to be from New Orleans, all that stuff. So we see a resurgence in traditional jazz bands during this time. That was a thing that you could go out and hear at this time. Moving on to the radio stuff. Some of you kind of missed the point on this question. Where I was really going with one of these radio questions was, it took a long time for radio stations to start making money. It just took them years and years and years to figure out kind of how to monetize the whole thing. So there's a detail in the book that said in 1929 or 1930, I can't remember which one it is, 1929 or 1930, there were around 750 radio stations in the United States, and only 12 of them made money. 12. So the vast, vast majority of radio stations weren't making any money at all. And so if they're not making money, certainly, they're not going to be wanting to pay royalties to the musicians who made the records that they're playing on the radio. Okay, so the point here is that it takes a very, very long time for radio stations to start making any money, and consequently, it's very hard for musicians to make any money with their records being on the radio. And it's just one more example of something that once again is just advertising for the concert, really. The book, the chapter about the radio industry talks a lot about transcriptions. And it doesn't do a very good job of explaining what transcriptions were, so I thought I would take a minute and talk about that. The records that they made for home use were engineered in such a way so that it would sound good on a home record player. Those records didn't necessarily sound very good going over the airwaves. It didn't sound that great on radio. Okay, so there became a need to kind of re-engineer these records so that they would sound better on radio. But once again, we're running into the whole issue where radio stations weren't making any money. So where is this money going to come from to re-engineer these recordings? So what happened was companies started subsidizing, what's the word I'm looking for? Subsidizing these things called transcriptions. And what transcriptions was a company would take these records, re-engineer them so they'd sound better on radio, okay? And then in between the songs, the company that sponsored, that's the word I'm looking for, the company that sponsored the transcription would insert their commercials in between the songs. So what transcriptions were like these 10-inch records that played for about 15 minutes, and they would usually have like 4 songs and 3 commercials, or 3 or 4 commercials in between. And so radio stations would just put on these transcriptions and let it play, and it would go for 15 minutes, and the commercials were like part of that record. And that made it a lot easier on the radio station. So they talk a lot about those transcriptions in that chapter. And that's what those things were. And that's kind of one of the ways in which, they were able to kind of somehow, get this thing going, was by playing these transcriptions. I also had a question in there that it was much simpler than a lot of you wanted it to be. I had a question about how far radio signals went back then. And the point there is that, and you guys some of you kind of struggled and came up with some weird answers. Where I was really going with that is just that there was so much less interference from other signals in those days that a big city radio station could be heard for hundreds of miles. The radio signal went much further back then because there was a lot less interference. That's the simple answer.
Dr. LaChance?
Yo.
I thought it had something to do with like AM waves versus FM, because FM didn't really exist then. I thought AM had something to do with it being not going as far or something to that effect.
That's true. AM signals don't go as far as FM signals. I don't remember reading anything from those early days about if amplitude modulation was exactly what they were doing. I'm not sure on the science on that. But you're right. Eventually, AM stations are the waves don't go around up and over mountains or around corners nearly as well, so it doesn't cover as much ground as FM. Right. But FM is I think it's a lot more expensive.
But it just didn't exist then, right? Isn't that?
Yeah, it didn't exist then because it's a lot more expensive. I don't think they had figured out the frequency modulation yet. Okay. I'm not exactly sure.
Thank you.
No problem. Moving on to the next reading quiz, the chapter 7 one. The thing with the whole no Irish need apply, most of you kind of got the idea on this one. A few of you missed it. The book says that it was a myth to kind of try to soften the blow of racism. In other words, by putting the idea out there that, hey, we're not just racist against black people, we hate Irish people too. Somehow that would make things better. And so that's really the point that book makes. I don't know that we can state that as a hard and fast fact, because we're talking about something like racism, and it's going to be a little bit different with each person. But the book makes the point that really wasn't economically as big a deal as a lot of people make it out to be, that mostly it was just there to kind of blunt the racism against African Americans. The short answer to the question about what business did mafia businesses go into after prohibition, after alcohol, the short answer to that, and a lot of you had all sorts of stuff, which is all true. The short answer to that is narcotics. Keep in mind that when musicians started using heroin a lot, keep in mind that nobody was growing heroin in their backyard. That came from somewhere. I mean, they grow that stuff in Asia. So there had to be a big organization that's bringing that kind of thing into the country. And that's where mafia came in. So mafia got heavily involved, organized crime got heavily involved. After Prohibition and the whole alcohol thing wasn't as profitable as it once had been, then they moved into importing drugs like heroin and things like that. There was a question about the Negro Leagues in baseball, and I found a lot of you kind of missed the point on that, in that while it might seem like a good opportunity, keep in mind that like it was yet another business where African Americans did the work and somebody else made the money. Keep in mind that it was yet another business where the players, didn't have any say in anything that went on. They were just, worker bees, and that sort of thing. So in other words, it was yet another way that they, had no control over their destiny and that sort of thing. And when the owners, when it was like too hard to make money, they would just fold up the team and, you were out of luck. Also, the point is made that like some of the same people that own Negro League teams were the same people who were exploiting African Americans already in other businesses. This was just another extension of that. So that was kind of the point that I was really going for on that one. Questions? The jazz diaspora question was one of the harder ones, and it's you have to read the Jazz and Justice chapter because that's where they talk about it a lot more. Basically, the idea, what I want to do is kind of get you away from the overly simplistic answer of the reason that jazz musicians moved from city to city was just because of racism, which is true, but there's a lot more details to that. Keep in mind that as a lot of musicians were working for businesses that were owned by organized crime. And organized crime is really great at one particular thing, which is monolithic businesses, which means that mafia types are really good at having a business and controlling all the supplies, all the supply chain to that business. They're really good at that. So while things are going well, it's a great way to make money. The problem with that monolithic type of business model is that as soon as anything goes wrong, there's no diversity in these companies. And as soon as something goes wrong, the whole thing goes down real quick. Okay. And I believe African American musicians were particularly susceptible to that sort of thing. During this time, they were really susceptible to these businesses kind of opening and closing and that sort of thing. And that's part of the reason why they moved from one city to the next was because of like that instability left them, no place else to go. And so much so that there were musicians playing in all sorts of crazy places. By the 1930s, there were jazz musicians playing in like Malaysia and Japan, and all sorts of places you would never think there would be any sort of jazz. And there's like a million reasons why people moved to different countries and different places and that sort of thing. But it had a lot to do with just kind of like business instability and the relative powerlessness of people who didn't have a lot of money and didn't have a lot of choices. Questions about that? So the diaspora that I'm talking about is both within the United States, jazz musicians moving from city to city, and also globally, musicians moving to Europe, musicians moving to Asia. All those things were going on. There was a question there about Cubans. There were several Cubans that were well-known jazz musicians in New York in the 1940s. And the part of the question was, what do these Cuban musicians, bring to jazz music? And the easy answer is, playing conga drums and, some of the rhythmic ideas from Cuban music are easy to kind of insert into jazz. But the more subtle and detailed answer is that Cubans were not necessarily white. They were most of them were of all sorts of mixed races and that sort of thing. So Cubans came in all sorts of various types of skin color, and it really made like the racism that black people suffered. It was like a really subtle kind of distinction between how people would treat Cubans and how people would treat American, blacks. And I think that's really the interesting. I don't know if I don't know if interesting is the right word, but that's like the detail that I'm kind of going for there. The other thing that the Cubans brought, so partly the Cubans brought kind of a slightly different attitude about racism with them. Okay, and I'm not saying it's a good thing or a bad thing. I'm just saying it makes the whole mix a little bit more, mm, a lot more aspects to that mix of racism. The other part of that answer would be um, um, just the outlook, not just the rhythms that they brought to the music, but just kind of their outlook about music was another thing that kind of worked its way into jazz. The really big picture here is that jazz, when at its beginnings was such an expression of black culture in New Orleans, and by this time it's evolved for some decades. And this is just one more example of culture that is gradually working its way into jazz. And so, like, the culture of jazz is becoming a wider and wider thing. And I think that was a little bit more of like the point of that question that I was going for. Another question that many of you had really good answers for was the question about jazz musicians becoming interested in Islam. This was happening in the 50s and 60s. A lot of jazz musicians were becoming interested in Islam. And there's a couple of reasons for this. Part of it has to do with just the whole idea about religions. I don't pretend to be some sort of expert on religions because I'm not. So a lot of you will probably know more about this than me. But the idea was that, like, a lot of people kind of looked at Christianity and said, but hold on a second, in the United States, we still have black churches and white churches. So, like, what kind of religion puts up with that sort of racial, segregation? What's that all about? And so they're looking for they're looking for a religion that's much more inclusive. And they found that in Islam because, it's much more inclusive racially. The other point that I wanted to make about that is that a lot of jazz musicians took, Muslim names. And that has to do with just the subtle difference between how they were treated. If you know what I mean, they were treated differently if people thought they were like a foreigner of some sort. You're from someplace else. They got treated differently than if they were just Charlie from Philadelphia. You know what I mean? And so that had something to do with it too. By just throwing that name into the mix, they felt like they were treated a little bit better. There again, I'm a little out of my element on that one. It's before my time, and I'm white. But there's a lot of subtle kind of ins and outs to the racism as it evolves, and this is one of them. I mentioned the Norman Granz concerts, Jazz at the Philharmonic. A lot of you made the mistake of assuming that Norman Granz was a musician, but he really wasn't. Norman Granz was a film editor, actually. Originally, he was a film editor. And when he moved to Los Angeles, he was shocked to find that, like, the jazz clubs in Los Angeles were still segregated. And so what he started doing was there was a jazz club in Los Angeles that was closed on Sundays. And so he started renting this jazz club on Sundays, and he started his own concert series. He would start having concerts there on Sundays, and he would, and he would have an integrated audience for these concerts. And from those little concerts in this jazz club in Los Angeles, that grew into bigger concerts in concert halls with integrated audiences, and then eventually it grew into actual whole tours. And there were like tons and tons of them, whole tours. And generally, they were pretty good work for black musicians. They were good work for black musicians. And, he insisted on integrated audiences. So here's a person who's kind of coming in from the outside. He's not a musician at all. And apparently, did some good things. Now, having said that, he's a concert promoter. And so if you read enough books, you're going to find some people who say, that asshole's terrible, he ripped me off or something like that. There's stuff out there that is kind of negative about Norman Granz, but I would still say the vast majority of it probably is not negative, it's positive. And certainly the idea of what he was doing was a step in the right direction for sure. So that's the story behind Norman Granz and the Jazz at the Philharmonic concerts. There were some questions about the recording industry. There was a chapter about the recording industry that you were supposed to read. And here again, one of the questions, I was really looking for just a simple answer, and some of you kind of gave me a complicated answer. The reason that, DJs, I don't think they were called that then, DJs at radio stations started talking between the records was because it was very noisy. They hadn't quite figured out how to only collect the DJs, like some of the sound in the studio and not all the sound in the studio. So in other words, all the picking up the needle off the record and taking the record off and putting a new one on and putting the needle on the record, all that stuff. It was all that extraneous noise was going on, and all of that was going out over the air. So that's why people in radio stations, originally they didn't talk on the air, they just played records. But there was all this noise between the records. So that's when they started talking in between the records, just to kind of cover up the noise. That's the simple answer that I was kind of looking for. And I just think it's an interesting little tidbit of information, about that era. I'm sorry, I'm still talking about radio stations. NARA, the Association of Recording Artists. The answer on that one, I had a lot of people kind of taking a shot at this one. What they were really about was not only were the radio stations not making money, so it's hard for musicians to make money, but there were radio stations that were playing pirated records. And so the NARA was another association that was formed to fight people playing pirated records on air. And it was just, it's just another way to make it cheaper by just cutting somebody out and, basically like using an illegal product on the air. There was a question about record labels that a lot of people kind of missed, at least partly. Part of the reason there were so many record labels was sure to cover different markets. There would be premium records and then cheaper records, to cover different markets and that sort of thing. But I think the deeper answer to that question was that, keep in mind, we're going through a period where we have records for home use, okay, that are designed to sound good on a home record player. And then we have records that are designed to be played over the radio. And then we start seeing records that are designed to be played on jukeboxes. All that stuff makes that industry really, really detailed and complicated. And I think the more you realize all these details about what's going on, the easier it is to see why it was so hard to make money on this, is because it was like a really convoluted system of different types of records and this and that, and keeping track of all that is very, very difficult. That's what ASCAP does, the Association of Composers, Publishers, etc. That's what that company is supposed to do, is keep track of who plays your record and what you're owed, who plays your piece and what you're owed in royalties, all those sorts of things. And it's really, really, really hard to do. Okay. Generally, what ASCAP does is they estimate how many people have used your song and pay you based on that. And so, of course, there's always fights about those estimates. But there's still, to this day, there's not really an exact way for them to tell, how often your song is played. It's a lot better now because, there's fewer radio stations. It's much easier to keep track of the playlist and that sort of thing. But back in the old days, it was even harder to keep track of all that sort of stuff. And that's why you have these associations, and that's why you also have constant fights about trying to get paid royalties for songs that other people are using, for records that other people are using. all that sort of thing. Plus the fact that, keep in mind that when a musician goes into Columbia Records and makes a record, the musician doesn't own that record. Columbia Records owns the record. Okay? So the musician might be able to cut a deal with Columbia Records. Okay? Might be able to cut a deal with Columbia Records and get paid some, but that's not necessarily going to happen. My time is running short here. I don't have the long version of Zoom, and I'm almost to the end. I only had one more thing to say. If I get cut off, I'll continue it on Thursday. I'm hoping that it'll just let me keep going. I think I have another 10 minutes, but I'm not 100% sure. If not, thanks for tuning in. Dang it, I have this all figured out.
You get 40 minutes, so you should be fine.
Yeah, I got it. Hey, Chris. Oh, here it is. Oh, the other question I had. The other question was about the. I love it. The other question I had was about the Modern Jazz Quartet and Birth of the Cool. The answer, a lot of you guys had a lot of correct answers because there's a lot of influences in those groups. The point I really wanted to make was that Modern Jazz Quartet and Birth of the Cool recordings are good examples of jazz music that was influenced by classical music. Okay, and the point here is that music education has evolved to the point where now jazz musicians aren't just self-taught all the time. A lot of jazz musicians have had at least some kind of school training in music and that sort of thing. And they become a lot more aware of classical music, and they start integrating the ideas of classical music into jazz music. And that's the point I want to make. Okay? Questions? Questions about what you guys are supposed to be doing? Have I given you too much work or too little? Nobody wants to say anything? I'm not hearing it. I'm not hearing anything.
Paper due?
What's that?
When is the last paper due? At the end of the.
I really want to. I really want to get it like next Monday.
Okay.
Next Monday is the last. Next Monday is officially the last day of classes. I will give you guys the final questions then. There's not going to be like a jillion final questions. There's going to be just a few of them, I believe, and they're going to be more in depth. But yeah, of course I will take stuff. I mean, the due dates have not worked out very well. I've got a lot of people with late stuff. But I think that's kind of happening in a lot of classes. And I don't want to fail anybody. I don't want to give anybody a bad grade. I want you guys to finish this class. So, I will continue taking stuff as long as I can. I can't remember off the top of my head when grades are due. Initially, our final exam time was on the 24th. And so grades are probably due somewhere around, I don't know, 26th or something like that. So you probably have a couple more weeks, but there's going to be the day is going to come when I'm going to have to give you whatever grade you have and move on from that. Okay. Yeah. So other questions? Hey, Eric. Other questions? There's two presentations I really want you to watch on Inquire. I have a couple PowerPoints where I've recorded comments along on the slides. One's about Miles Davis and one's about Jaco Pastorius. Make sure that you look at those because I will definitely put something on the final that has to do with those two presentations because I think those are the two things that kind of take you into the much more modern piece of jazz, which will be a lot more interesting for some of you. And it's a good, I don't want to leave out too much of the history. It's kind of hard to get through all of jazz history in one semester. There's a lot of stuff. So this is a little bit of the more modern things. So please watch those because I will put something on the final that, makes it worth your while to watch those. And both of those are associated with a playlist on our YouTube page. Okay, so there's a There's a playlist called Inc. 271 Miles Davis, which is the list of pieces that you should listen to that go along with the PowerPoint. Same thing for Jaco Pastorius. There's one called Inc. 271, Jaco Pastorius. Those are the tunes you listen to along with the Jaco Pastorius presentation. I realized I could have put links, on each slide. I could have put links to those tunes, but I don't know. I think for future, I think I just wanted to go ahead and just make a playlist. So I'm hoping that that's okay. But you guys are, you guys can handle having two apps open at once. You guys do that all day long. Anybody else? I've been working my way through Silicon Valley. If you guys haven't watched Silicon Valley, it's on HBO. It's a comedy. Very funny. Good stuff. And my future son-in-law is in one of the episodes. My future son-in-law is an actor. And he's in season 2, episode 8, I think. Just for about 15 seconds. Those guys make insane money for going into work for like 2 hours. Anything else? You guys like doing this?
Nope.
What don't you like about it?
I miss being in class, to be honest.
Me too. It's not very much fun kind of doing it like this,
Being
Um,
stuck fun, like at all.
What's that?
Being stuck at home, like not being able to leave or go anywhere or see people sucks. Like
It does. Yeah. And unfortunately, it's going to be a while. Like, I usually teach at band camp in Michigan over the summer, and they just canceled the whole thing yesterday. So, like, yeah, everything I had going is canceled for months on end. So, yeah, I'm gonna have to start writing, my magnum opus. Start writing my symphony.
Your symphony number 9.
My symphony number 9. Yeah, I have the first 8 in my head. The first 8 symphonies I meant to write, but didn't get around to it. But I'm working on some videos for the jazz band kids that we'll use in the future too. So anyway, please let me know. Email me if you have any questions. I've been trying to get back to everybody as fast as I can on reading quizzes and that sort of thing. So keep sending those to me. They're open book tests. Can't make it very much easier than that. So good luck to you all, and I will see you at this time on Thursday again. Okay? Bye.
Thanks, Dr. LaChance.
You bet. No problem.